You ready? You guys ready? Okay. Good evening. Hi, everybody. Nice to be back. I took a couple weeks off with my grandchildren, and you would think I was rested, but I'm exhausted. But before we get into tonight's program, I do want to talk about next week. Next week, we're going to have Jim O'Connell, who I'm told is an excellent speaker. He will use his collection of historic postcards to illustrate the Cape's rise and evolution as a major tourist attraction. I think it might be interesting. Tonight, thanks to our sponsors, the Town of Barnstable Tourism Grant, and our very own Phineas Fisk, who I don't think is here tonight, we are hosting New York Times bestseller, based in Boston, David Wedge. Not yet. I have a lot of stuff to say about him. He writes for Boston Magazine, and he has written for Esquire, Vice, and Newsweek. And additionally, he was an award-winning investigative journalist for Boston Herald for 14 years. He has appeared on many network and cable news programs. David Wedge's books include, and these you will recognize most of them because he writes very often in collaboration with Casey Sherman, who has also been a speaker here. Boston Strong, which became the movie Patriots Day. Ice Bucket Challenge, about Pete Freitas and his fight against ALS. 12, the inside story of Tom Brady's fight for redemption. That's Inflategate. Hunting Whitey Bulger, and many others. Dave Wedge also wrote Riding with Evil, Taking Down the Notorious Pagans Motorcycle Gang, the true story of ATF agent Ken Croak. Tonight, Dave will talk about the untold story of marvelous Marvin Hagler's Battle for Glory, the subject of his latest book, Blood and Hate. And we thank Tick Combs for being here tonight to offer this book to you for sale. So at the moment, I'm very pleased to introduce David Wedge.
Hello. Hello, everybody. That one good? Good. Thank you, Ann, for that lovely introduction. So excited to be here. Tales of Cape Cod. Thank you, Ann, to you and your board for putting this on. It's such a great venue. It's such an honor to be in a historic building like this. I just learned tonight it's 1763. Is that right? Yeah. Absolutely amazing. And you know, I was here a little early and no one was here, and I walked in and it was empty, and I was like, this place is definitely haunted, you know. But hopefully in a good way. Hopefully the ghosts are friendly. And I know there's a lot of ghost stories that are told here, and a lot of true crime, and I've done a lot of that. As Ann mentioned, I've done a lot of events with Casey Sherman. Has anyone seen Casey before? So Casey and I have written 6 books together, including Boston Strong, which became the movie Patriots Day. And this one is not really true crime, but there's definitely some true crime elements. There's boxing involved, so when there's boxing, what follows that? Organized crime, right? There's also some corruption. There's some racism. There's riots. There's violence. So, but it's also a beautiful story of love and loyalty and friendship and perseverance. And so before I get into the story, I'll tell you a little bit about why I wrote this book and how I kind of got to this point. So as Ann mentioned, I was at the Boston Herald for 14 years, and I covered a lot of news and politics and music and sports, and I left to write Boston Strong. But I grew up in Brockton, and my family we actually had a house in Hyannis for many years. My family had a house on C Street Beach over by the Kennedy compound, and we sold that when I was in college. And but I grew up coming to the Cape every weekend, so I feel like I'm one of those seasonal Capers, I guess, you know, and owned a house in Dennis, a little condo, me and my wife for many years, and we sold it right before the pandemic. But Brockton is where I was born and raised, so growing up in Brockton, everyone, depending on your generation, you either have a connection to Marvelous Marvin Hagler, like me, or Rocky Marciano, who was from Brockton as well. My dad was actually Rocky Marciano's paperboy. And when I was a little kid, my dad was a big boxing fan because of Rocky, and it's like kind of in your blood when you're born in a city like Brockton. And my dad would take me to the Golden Gloves and took me up to the golf course for celebrity tournaments when Marvin was just starting, and Marvin would be there. So I met him when I was a little kid. And my first boxing match ever, my dad took me to the Boston Garden, the old Boston Garden, in 1980 against Vito Antifermo. And it was Marvin's first title defense, which is actually the first fight he had after the fight that I write about in this book that I'll get to. But I was 10 years old, and never forget it. It was like yesterday. The old Boston Garden, you could smoke, so there was a layer of thick smoke, and I was a little 10-year-old kid watching these guys beat each other up, and another dad was with us and another one of my friends, and I'll just always remember Marvin. Does anyone remember that fight? Marvin beat the heck out of that guy. He cut him wide open. The guy got 50 stitches across his head after the fight, and I remember being a little kid seeing through the smoke and all the blood pouring down the guy's face, and they raised Marvin's hand up, and I was like, wow, that guy's from my hometown. That's really cool. So that's what kind of made me fall in love with boxing, and I followed Marvin's career. In the 80s, Marvin had, before cable TV and 24 hours on the phones and all that, it was the Celtics, Red Sox, Bruins, and Patriots, and Marvin Hagler. And they one of his nicknames was the fifth franchise, they would call him, because his fights were must-see TV. It was appointment viewing. I remember going to, movie theaters and function halls, and it was on closed-circuit cable TV, the fights. They were that big of a deal. So I always had that in my blood. And I started writing all these books after I left the Herald, and I always had in the back of my mind, I'd love to write a book about Marvin Hagler. And I actually tried to do it with Marvin while he was alive, but it never really worked out. And then when he passed away in 2021, I was just finishing up my last book, which was the one that Ann just mentioned, called Riding with Evil, about bikers, and that's a true crime, kind of crazy true crime story. But after I finished that, I said, I think it's time I write this book. So I buckled down, and here it is. Blood and Hate just came out in June. So I'll tell you a little bit, and there's a lot of Cape connections to Marvin's story. Some of you in the room are probably well aware of Marvin's connection to the Cape, but we'll start here. So really what this book is about, it's not a full biography of Marvelous Marvin Hagler. It's about this photo. Does anyone recognize this photo? So this is a very famous photo, and it's the story of this book. Marvin Hagler went through a very long journey to get to this fight on September 27th, 1980 in Wembley Arena in London, England. And when he did, and he finally won, this was the result. He was pelted with bottles, and he was run out of the arena by racists. And I'll tell you the story as we go along, but I just wanted to kind of set the tone here that this is what we're talking about. Not really a sports book. It's a story of a guy who endured this sort of treatment despite his greatness. So this book is the story of this photo. So I'll set the stage. It's Newark, 1967. They called it the long, hot summer of 1967. There were riots all over the country. There were some in Boston. They were in Alabama, Chicago, Watts. One of the worst ones in the country was in Newark, where Marvelous Marvin Hagler, well, he was just Marvin then, 15 years old, lived with his mother and his 5 siblings. There was no father in the house. They lived in the worst neighborhood in Newark, where all the rioting took place. 26 people were killed in a weekend during these riots in that summer. And the riots started because this guy right here, John Smith, he was a saxophone player and a cab driver, and he got pulled over by 2 white Italian police officers. And the neighborhood where they lived was called the Central Ward, and it was almost all black, and the police force was almost all white. And Newark at that time, and I tell the story in the book, it was going through one of the most extreme racial transitions that any city in American history has ever gone through. It went from like being overwhelmingly like 70, 80% white to being 70, 80% black in like a year and a half, 2 years. And it was all because of the way that the city had engineered the housing, and they built a new highway, and it literally divided this community, and there was really horrible racial tensions going on at the time. So John Smith gets pulled over. He was a terrible cab driver. He got an a fender bender that day, and he had some sort of violation. He pulled around a police officer, and he was speeding. So they pulled him over, and they dragged him out of the car, and he was beaten up pretty badly. He was dragged to the police station, and he was beaten some more, and there was some protests that were already kind of getting underway about police brutality in Newark at the time. And, we saw the George Floyd stuff, 5 years ago. It's no comparison what was going on. This stuff was very public, and the people knew what was going on. They were about to have a protest when they saw John Smith being dragged into the police station, and that lit the match to the powder keg. And it just really erupted into horrible, horrible violence. Marvin and his family became prisoners in their home. He's a 15-year-old kid, no father in the house. All his siblings were younger than him, and they enacted martial law in Newark, and the family ended up having to stay in the house. They couldn't leave. They had to leave the lights off. There was snipers on rooftops that were shooting at people. There was, terrible gun battles going on daily outside their house, and bullets actually ricocheted through their house while they were little kids. And for those 3 days, they would slide across couch cushions to stay away from the windows to go to the bathroom in the kitchen. And imagine that, being a little kid. So that's the world that Marvin Hagler was living in at that time. His mother finally had enough, and in the summer of 1969, there were some more riots, a second round. They weren't quite as bad, but they were pretty bad. And his mother, Ida Mae, said, you know what, we're getting out of here. She had two older sons, Marvin and his brother Robbie Sims, who actually also became a professional boxer. And she was afraid that Robbie and Marvin were going to get lost to the streets. So she brought them to Brockton. And, being from Brockton, it has a reputation of being a rough city, but imagine 1969, you're safer in Brockton. You're moving to Brockton to get safe, And that's what she did, though. But Brockton at that time was actually a much safer community than it is today. And it was certainly a lot safer than Newark. So they had family there. And another thing happened in 1969. Rocky Marciano died in a plane crash. And Goody Petronelli and Pat Petronelli, who became Marvin Hagler's trainers, were great friends with Rocky Marciano. And they were actually going to be opening a gym together in Brockton that Rocky was going to put his name on. And it was a huge thing for the Petronelli brothers. They were going to use it to market and get new fighters, and it really would have brought a lot of attention to the city. When Rocky died in that plane crash, they were lost. They didn't know what they were going to do. And lo and behold, that summer was when Marvin Hagler moved to Brockton. They didn't know who he was, but he went out one night, as 15-year-old kids do, and he went to a teenage party in the housing projects on the east side of Brockton, and he ran into this guy, Dornell Wigfall. Now, Dornell was a great football player at Brockton High, and at the time, Brockton High had one of the best football programs in the whole country. And the New England Patriots were actually scouting Dornell Wigfall, but he was also an amateur boxer. Marvin didn't know that, and he talked to his girlfriend. And they went outside, and Marvin had never fought in his life. They went outside and fought, and Marvin was on the losing end of that fight. He got beat up pretty bad. He had to go to the hospital. He broke a tooth. And Marvin actually hid underneath the car to stop himself from getting beaten up. The next day, Marvin said, that's never going to happen to me again. And that's when he started fighting, and he walked into Petronelli Brothers' gym. So here's the two Petronelli brothers reeling from the loss of their friend, Rocky, who died very uncertain of their future, and in walks, little did they know, what would eventually become their future as well. So and that was a great thing about writing this book, is I didn't know a lot of this stuff, and the timeline and the serendipity of the way things happened in this story is pretty incredible, even to me as someone who grew up there. So this is a picture of Marvin, young Marvin, on the right, and that's Tony Petronelli. Tony Petronelli was Pat Petronelli's brother. So there was two brothers, Goody and Pat. Goody was the trainer, and Pat was kind of the business guy. Tony was Pat's son, and Tony was a great boxer himself. He was a pro. He had about 40 pro fights. He fought for the title as a welterweight. And when Marvin first showed up in the gym around this time of this photo, Marvin was his protege. So, and Marvin would carry his bag to the pro fights and all that stuff, and he learned the fight game from Tony and his dad, obviously, and Goody. It wouldn't be long before those roles were reversed, and Tony would eventually be carrying Marvin's bags. So as Marvin starts fighting, and he turned pro pretty quickly, and one of the first, actually the third pro fight that he had was a rematch against Dornell Wigfall, and the guy that beat him up in the projects. And when they fought at Brockton High, and it's a legendary fight. I write about it in the book extensively. If you read it, it's a pretty fascinating story. Captivated the city. The gym was packed at Brockton High, and Marvin got his revenge that night on a pro stage. So it was pretty incredible. You know, it was only a couple of years from the time he got beat up in a parking lot till he actually beat him in a professional setting. Marvin went on to start fighting pro, and he was beating a lot of really good fighters. He rose through the ranks pretty quickly, but because he was an unknown and because the Petronelli brothers were unknowns, he couldn't get any fights. And at that time, in the 70s, this was in the mid-70s, the boxing game was extremely corrupt. It still has an air of corruption today, but back then it was extremely corrupt. People like Don King ran the fights, and if you didn't pay to be one of Don King's fighters, you weren't getting a title shot. Bob Arum was one of the biggest promoters in the world. Same thing. If you weren't connected to Bob Arum, you weren't getting a title shot. So Marvin had to go down to Philadelphia to fight guys like this. This is Willie the Worm Monroe. And the names of these fighters, if you read the book, is amazing. So Marvin he beat everyone in New England, and he beat a lot of guys from New York and Connecticut. And at the time, the middleweight division, which is what Marvin was, had 4 great fighters. And Goody and Pat Petronelli said, you know what, we got to go down to Philly, we got to fight the Iron. They were called the Iron of the division. And Marvin went down and fought them all. It was Willie the Worm Monroe, Bad Benny Briscoe, Eugene Cyclone Hart, and what was the other one? Boogaloo Watts. How could I forget Boogaloo Watts? The first guy he fought was Boogaloo Watts, and it was a terrible decision. Everyone agrees Marvin won the fight. I even interviewed the promoter of that fight, a guy named J. Russell Peter from Philadelphia. These fights were all at the Spectrum. Do you remember the Spectrum from the Rocky movie? That's where all these fights took place, and these guys were all from Philadelphia. That first fight when Marvin went in there, he had a lot of buzz, like, oh, here's this tough guy from Boston, you know, and he came in, and he won the fight against Boogaloo Watts. He beat him pretty good, but he lost a terrible decision. And they gave the fight to Boogaloo Watts, and it was so bad that the next day, the Philadelphia newspapers taunted Marvin with the headline that said, "Welcome to Philly, Marvin." And from that moment on, Marvin had a very sour taste in his mouth about the judges in boxing. He knew that he had to beat people in order to get a fair shake, and it was a theme that continued throughout his career. He went back, and he had this fight against Willie the Worm Monroe. And this is actually, most experts that watch the fight game agree that this is the only fight that Marvin actually truly lost. Marvin got beat up really bad. So he went to Philly, and he was 0-2. And he was reeling. He had just started dating who would become his first wife, Bertha. And Bertha had 2 kids that Marvin's now helping to raise. He's only a young man in his early 20s. All of a sudden, he's a dad, got his own apartment, trying to make a living boxing, and he loses these 2 fights. And Goody and Pat say, you know what, you got to keep going, kid. You got 2 more guys to fight down there, so let's go. So he went down, he took on the next 2. He took on Cyclone Hart and Bad Benny Briscoe, and he ended up winning those 2 fights. And it changed his career, changed his life. This is an interesting thing. I threw this in there just for a little, so you can get a little flavor of the era we're at. But this is a Western Union telegram that I got from, it's from Pat Petronelli to the promoter, Russell Peltz, about the fight. And it says, terms are agreeable to us for Marvin Hagler to box Willie Monroe, $3,000, or the percentage we'll decide when we get there Wednesday for the press luncheon, which one to go with. So they basically said either $3,000 or a percentage of the gate. You know, it just kind of shows you in a telegram, you know. I wasn't old enough, I don't remember telegrams, but I thought it was awesome. So. But that's how business was done back then. It was handshakes and things like that. You know, there was no contracts. This was the contract, basically. And this is the three guys I'm talking about. That's Marvelous Marvin Hagler in the middle, obviously. On the left is Goody Petronelli, and on the right is Pat Petronelli. Now, the interesting thing about them, they called themselves the Triangle as time went on, because they went to Philly and built this great friendship. They started to really trust each other. The reason it's so important and why I love this story and why I think it's such a beautiful story is because Goody and Pat are, look at the picture, they were, middle-aged, white, Italian, World War II veterans. Marvin Hagler is a young black kid that didn't trust anyone and came from one of the worst environments that one can imagine with no dad. When he came into Brockton and walked into that gym, he didn't know who to trust. He didn't trust a lot of white people. The only white folks that he really knew at the time were police officers, teachers, authority figures, and a lot of them weren't very nice to the people in his community. It took a long time for him to build that trust and that friendship with the Petronellis. And the same with the Petronellis. They had a lot of fighters come through, and they talked a big game. I'm going to be world champ, and I'm this and that, and they'd fight for 3 months, and then they'd disappear. So they had their own trust issues with their fighters. They soon realized that Marvin was committed. And there's a great scene in the book where, Marvin goes in the first, one of the first days, and he's sitting there talking to Goody. He's like, so what do you want to do, kid? And he goes, and Marvin said, I'm going to be the world middleweight champ of the world. And Goody says, all right, and I'm going to be your trainer. And that's kind of how they started building that trust. But more importantly, everything they taught him in that gym that day and every day forward, Marvin would come back the next day and he remembered everything. Because he went home after the gym and he practiced it in the mirror. And they would ask him, they'd say, you look great, kid. How'd you pick that up so quick? He goes, well, I went home and I worked on it in the mirror all night. So that's how committed he was. He was just that kind of person that he wanted to be great. And he was the kind of fighter that they needed in order for them to take their boxing business to the next level, now with no Rocky Marciano. Anybody know that guy? Only in America. That's Don King. So Marvin goes to Philly, goes 2-2, and he's rising through the ranks. He's beating everyone in sight. And in 76, the United States is having a romance with boxing. It's the year Rocky came out. It's the bicentennial. And the Olympics that year in Montreal launched the careers of Leon Spinks, who was one of the greatest heavyweights of his era, and Sugar Ray Leonard. And Sugar Ray Leonard and Leon Spinks became huge household names because they both won the gold in those Olympics. So Don King, ever the opportunist, decided to launch what he called a Tournament of Champions. And it was on ABC, national television. And he partnered with The Ring magazine, which at the time was the biggest boxing publication in the world. And The Ring magazine kept the rankings of the fighters. So they were the ones that said, all right, you're the number one contender, you're the champ, you're number 2, you're number 3, 4, 5, all the way through. Shockingly, every fighter that made it into the Tournament of Champions was one of Don King's fighters. Marvin was not. So Marvin refused to sign with Don King. Don King went to the Petronelli brothers and said, I'll put your boy in the tournament, but you got to sign with me. He has to become one of my fighters. And Marvin said no, so he wouldn't put him in. And Marvin had beat most of the guys in this tournament already, and the rest he would have beat easy. What happened next is there was a lot of inconsistencies in the rankings that some smart boxing writers figured out, and they started looking into it. Remember, this is before the internet. There's no YouTube. Can't go look up the records online. These records are all paper or sometimes just verbal. Yeah, the guy's 12-0. They made up all these records for these different fighters. They fabricated fights. There was some guys that weren't even professional fighters anymore. There was one guy that was a cop in Texas that fought when he was a kid, and they attributed all these 9 victories to him, and they made him like the number 4 contender and put him on TV. So it became this huge scandal. The whole thing fell apart. The FCC got involved. ABC had to apologize. People lost their jobs. The New York Boxing Commission got involved. It became a real disaster. And, classic Don King. And he blamed it on everybody else. He said it was ABC's fault. It was the Ring magazine's fault. It was just a paperwork snafu. It was nothing he did wrong. But Marvin kept fighting and winning. It got so bad that, and here's where we get to the Cape. Everybody knows who that guy is. Senator Kennedy represented this very district where we are right now. Ted Kennedy and Marvin were friends. Marvin used to go to his political events when he was coming up through the ranks, and Ted Kennedy would go watch Marvin train down in P-Town, because when Marvin started becoming really good, he liked to get away to train for his fights. He had to get away from Brockton. Remember, he had a wife and a couple of young kids, so he would go down to the Provincetown Inn at the very tip of the Cape, and he called it prison. He would go there in the off-season, in the winter, fall, and spring, because, you know, back then there was no work from home, there was no internet, there was no cell phones, so some of you lifelong Cape folks know that P-Town in the 70s in the off-season was a real ghost town. There was nobody down there. Most stuff was closed, and it was very private, and that's what Marvin liked about it. He could just eliminate all the distractions, and he would, you know, just train, and he'd run in the dunes on the sand. I get a great picture of that coming up, but Ted Kennedy loved that about Marvin, loved that he trained on the Cape, loved that he had a connection to Cape Cod, and so when he got word that Don King was doing this shady stuff with the rankings and ABC and all that, Ted Kennedy and the other gentleman here is former House Speaker Tip O'Neill from Boston, who was another great boxing fan and knew the Petronelli brothers. Senator Kennedy and House Speaker O'Neill went to Bob Arum and said, give our guy a shot or we're launching a congressional investigation into the fight game. And I interviewed Bob Arum for this book, and Bob Arum now is about 95 years old. I went out to Vegas and met with him, and he's just one of those very colorful characters. You know, he's had Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali and George Foreman and everybody. And he told me, he said, Marvin Hagler was my favorite fighter. He said he loved Marvin Hagler. And what he told me, he said, he remembered it like it was yesterday. He said, I got the letters from Tip and Ted. That's what we called Tip and Ted. And he said, you know, they're threatening to bring my ass before Congress. I don't need this. So he promised Marvin that he would get his title shot, and it eventually did come against this guy right here. This is Alan Boom Boom Minter. So after that, after Ted and Tip get involved, Arum says, listen, I'll give him the winner of Antifermo and this guy named Hugo Coro, and Vito Antifermo won the fight. And it's a funny story in the book that I tell. There's a legendary story that Coro and Antifermo both were kind of hesitant to win because they knew they were going to have to fight Hagler after. They both were a little skittish about him because they knew that Marvin was the best. I mean, everyone in the world kind of knew that Marvin was the best, and a lot of the boxing writers were saying he was already the champion, even though he hadn't got the shot. Marvin fought Vito Antifermo at Caesar's Palace, 1979, I believe it was. And again, most people agree that Marvin won the fight, Bob Arum included. Bob Arum told me that for this book, that he definitely won the fight, but he lost the decision. It was a very lopsided decision. Two judges had it about the same, and one judge had it very skewed in favor of Antifermo. Turned out that guy was an Italian judge, and Antifermo was from Italy. So it was again another example of Marvin. A lot of people would say not getting a fair shake from the system. Instead of Marvin getting a rematch against Antifermo, Antifermo was matched up with this guy, Alan Minter. Now, Alan Minter was a blue-collar kid from Crawley, England. Really tough kid. His dad was a plasterer, and he grew up working with his dad, laboring and things like that. And, you know, he was the great white hope in the division, but especially in England. There hadn't been a world champion boxer in England for several decades before Alan Minter. And Alan Minter actually fought in the 1972 Olympics as an amateur. And anyone know what the 1972 Olympics were famous for? In Munich, the terror attack. Alan Minter witnessed that terror attack. He was there. He was staying on the property. He fought the day before the terror attack, and that night was actually his brother's birthday. And I interviewed his brother for the book, and he recalled it for me. And they went out, you know, they're Brits, so here's the kid, he's, you know, 21 years old or whatever in the Olympics. He fights, and then they go out to the pubs to celebrate his brother's birthday that night. And while they're out in the pubs, this terror attack unfolds. So they come back to the Olympic Village, and it's all locked down. They can't get in. and they just stood outside the fence and they heard the gunshots, and it was people being executed. And it's a really, there's a new movie about it now that just came out. I think it's called like September '72 or something, but it was a terrible, the Israeli Olympic team got kidnapped and they were all executed by terrorists. But Minter was there for that. Flash forward, Alan had a great pro career, much like Marvin, but he rose up the ranks a lot quicker than Marvin did. And a lot of it was because he was the Great White Hope and he was British. He was a different kind of fighter. He was box office, very handsome guy, steely blue eyes. He was in all the TV ads all over Britain. He was very famous. He was a household name at the time. He fought Vito Antuofermo, and Alan Minter won a very close decision in that fight. So that sets up Marvin's chance finally to have a pro fight, a title fight. And, Marvin probably should have had at this point he had 52 or 53 fights, and he only lost 3. He probably should have had that title fight 10 or 15 fights earlier, but he didn't. And Alan Minter was backed by this group, the National Front. I apologize, it's a pretty disturbing image, but I show it because this is what was going on in London, England at the time in 1980. This group, the National Front, was based in Crawley, England, which was Alan Minter's hometown. Now, Alan Minter and his family deny that he was a part of the group. He's never admitted that he was part of the organization, but he's never denounced their teachings. He never said that he, rejected their teachings either. At the time in England, the National Front was in the middle of a campaign of terror. They were flying these things all over the subways, all over London. There was a lot of fire bombings. There was a lot of rioting. There was protests. People lost their lives, and it was all people of color that were being targeted by this group. And it was anti-immigration stuff is basically what it was. And the National Front, they still exist today. Actually, it's a neo-Nazi group, so they're fascists and racists and all that stuff. And Alan Minter actually spoke at some of their events, and they embraced him because they looked at him as a national hero, symbolically. And it was it was an unfortunate thing that Marvin walked into, but this was the setting that Marvin walked into after all this time, dodging bullets in Newark as a little kid, fighting all the corruption in the industry, people like Don King, and he finally gets his title fight, and it's under these circumstances. And this is just another National Front flyer. They were posting these all over the place, but some of you might recognize, some of the language there. I don't want to make this political, but when I found this stuff, I was like, really? And this is the photo I talked about with Marvin down in P-Town. This is where he trained, and he called it prison. But if you look at that, that's wintertime on Race Point, out at the dunes, and that's where he trained. And Goody Petronelli would run along with him. I've always wondered who took this picture. Who was the crazy one out there following him around in the 20 degrees in the icy ocean? And that's out by the Provincetown Inn again. So the fight comes along. It's September 27th, 1980. Alan Minter, Marvin Hagler, and it's at Wembley Arena. And Marvin went out there with his wife Bertha and the Petronelli brothers, and his brother Robbie Sims came as well. The weigh-in was a big circus. It was, Alan Minter comes in with the St. George Cross and the Union Jack, and he's got Union Jack underwear and all the, the pomp and circumstance. And Marvin comes in, and he was actually overweight by like a pound. And they had the ring girls were there, for the cameras. It was televised. And they said, Marvin, you have 4 hours to get down to 160 to lose the weight. So Marvin said, all right, we need everyone out of here, especially the women. So he had to get all the women out, and they all left. And he disappeared for a few hours. No one would tell me what he did, but whatever he did, he jumped rope, I don't know. But he came back out in only his jockstrap. And that's why he asked everyone to clear the room. But he made weight, and it was tense. If he didn't make weight, he would have forfeited the fight. He would have had to reschedule. And again, it's significant that it's at Wembley Arena, which, it's a historic arena. There hadn't been a world championship boxing match involving a Brit there for many decades. So the national fever for Alan Minter was really high. The people were really excited about it. Unfortunately, this is what Alan Minter said at a press conference before the fight. No black man is going to take my title away. And, you know, if someone said that today, the word viral doesn't even begin to describe it, you know, but this obviously became global headlines, and this was, again, the setting that Marvin Hagler walked into in Wembley Arena. And Minter, you know, afterwards he tried to couch, well, I didn't mean any black man, I meant that black man, so he tried to, like, double down, and it was a terrible comment. He did later apologize for saying it, but it ratcheted up the racial tension surrounding this fight, especially among Alan Minter's fans, because they were happy he said this. You know, they wanted this. This is just a ticket from the fight I wanted to show you. It's just kind of cool thing I came across. 50 pounds to sit ringside. You know, today that would be 5,000 at least for a ringside title fight. So they have the fight, and there's one other thing about Alan Minter. So Alan Minter, about 3 fights before this fight, he was just like Marvin, fighting his way up. And, you know, again, tough kid, blue-collar kid, and he had a fight against an Italian fighter named Angelo Jacopucci. And Alan Minter beat Jacopucci really badly, beat him and put him in the hospital. And actually, he died. The fighter died. So Alan had killed a guy in the ring, so when he's coming into this fight, he's still dealing with those demons of killing a guy in the ring. He won his next 2 fights pretty handily, but his brother told me that, and he beat Vito Antuofermo obviously to win the title. His brother told me that he doesn't think that he trained as hard as he did in his other fights for Marvin, and that was his fatal mistake. So they get in the ring and they fight. I'm going to show a quick video at the end here. I can just do it down here, right? I can just click on it? Okay. I'll show you a little bit of what happens so you can get the full scope. But Marvin wins the fight. Alan Minter gets cut up pretty bad. Like I described Vito Antuofermo getting cut. Alan Minter, similar. He had a problem with getting facial cuts. And this is the last moment of glory that Marvin had in that night. You know, if you look at that picture, first of all, I mean, notice the shape the guy's in. You know, that was before all the technology we have now. That was just hardcore eating right and relentless working out, and that was a lot due to Goody Petronelli and his techniques. And that referee there is Richard Steele, who was a very famous referee. He went on to referee some of the most famous bouts in history. And right after this picture is when this happened. So that night at Wembley Arena, the arena was not only filled with members of the National Front, but there was tons of soccer hooligans there as well. And they used to sell bottles of beer at the arena. Actually, they sold cases of bottles of beer. So these soccer hooligans and members of the National Front were literally taking cases of 24 beers up to the upper levels. And the fight only lasted 3 rounds. So they had a lot of beers left. And they all came down, and they rained down after that last picture when Marvin's hands were raised in victory. The bottles started pelting him. Goody Petronelli got hit in the head with a bottle. Bob Arum was there, and he told me that him and Howard Cosell jumped under the ring to hide from the bottles. The reporters that were covering the fight were covering their heads with their typewriters, you know, old school typewriters, you know, metal, thankfully, not plastic laptops. Those wouldn't have done well. But it was a terrible scene, and Marvin and his family got hustled out by the Bobbies. The Bobbies came in and protected them, the police officers with the helmets. There was some more rioting outside. Windows were broken, and, you know, several people were arrested, and the family got sent. You know, they finally made it back to the hotel. And the sad part about it is, you know, Marvin went through all that I talked to you about, you know, his whole journey of trying to get to this moment. When he finally gets to that moment, it's taken away from him because of these people that just hated him because of the color of his skin. And it's unthinkable that it happened. You know, a lot of people, young people, wouldn't believe that something like this would happen, and it wasn't that long ago, 1980. But the beautiful thing is, when they finally all got back to the hotel, Robbie Sims, Marvin's brother, and another member of the entourage had an American flag, and they opened it up and they started singing patriotic songs, and they're smoking cigars and drinking whiskey, and they had a party. But Marvin never got his belt in England. He flew home the next day with his family and his entourage, and he didn't get his belt for 3 weeks. They mailed it back to him in Brockton, but then Brockton had, as one would imagine, one of the biggest parades really the biggest parade the city ever had since Rocky Marciano. So it was, you know, it was a beautiful thing for Marvin. And the funny thing about this story is that, you know, Marvin wasn't a super political guy. And here's the front page of the Brockton Enterprise. Marvin brings the title home. You know, this is like all little kids watching the fight in some pool hall in downtown Brockton. You know, that's how it was. But he wasn't a very political guy. And when I was writing the story, you know, he's not Bill Russell. He's not Muhammad Ali. He's not Jesse Owens. He wasn't the black fist guy, you know, in the air. But he carried himself with a quiet dignity. And I actually compare him a lot to Bill Belichick. He was all business like that. Like, he was kind of, you know, he would say some funny things to the press sometimes, but he wasn't like a big showman. He was more like, yep, you know, it's just another fight. I took care of business, and, you know, he's going to be sorry, that sort of thing. He was confident, but he wasn't cocky, and he wasn't flashy. But I feel like, and a big reason why I wrote the book was because I feel like that legacy has never been delivered. No one really knows that story that I just told of him fighting that, you know, racially intense fight and being disrespected that way on the public stage. And the English papers had a field day with it. They called it national disgrace, you know, night of, you know, all horrible. It was a huge embarrassment to England, and there was a lot of apologies that came Marvin Hagler's way after that. But he went on to, as we all know, become one of the greatest middleweights of all time. And in fact, this is a great picture that I actually took this picture. So this is at Brockton High at Rocky Marciano Stadium after Marvin Hagler died. So after Marvin passed away in 2021, it was right at the end of COVID, and the family didn't really want to have a big service for him, but I got together with the mayor of Brockton, and we said, you know, we have to honor Marvin. You know, he's the biggest icon in the city's history besides Rocky Marciano. We have to do it right. So we had a big, huge thing. We invited Tommy Hearns. That's Tommy Hearns, who Marvin fought famously in 1985. We invited Tommy to come. We never heard from him. He never returned our calls, never got back to us. And we have this thing, and all of a sudden, we're about to start, and in walks Tommy Hearns. He just showed up. That's how much respect he had for Marvin Hagler. And he's having some problems himself with the, you know, his mental capacity's not there, but he spoke very fondly of Marvin Hagler. And a Brockton artist actually drew that photo of Marvin there that he's holding. And then last year, 2024, we finally dedicated this statue to Marvelous Marvin Hagler, and it's a beautiful statue, and those are the 3 belts, and it's located right next to the Petronelli Brothers gym, where he started, and that's now condos, of course, right? Isn't everything? And but yeah, it's right there where it all started for Marvin. So if you guys don't mind, I'm going to show you the end of the Minter fight so you can visualize what I'm talking about, and then I'll open it up to some questions. Do you want to handle it? Oh, great. And I think if you play it, I had it queued up at the right.
Share your best idea.
So this is the end of the fight, not this ad.
If you're an illegal alien, this runway is your future because you're headed home. I'm Christine Owen.
Here we go. This is the third round. Scheduled 15.
Mitchell made a terrible mistake of trying to mix it up with Hagler in the second round. That's Hagler's game, and Mitchell cannot punch.
Let me fast forward a little here to the.
Here in the third round, in the beginning, Mitchell seemed cautious, but already they were cuts. Still struggling, still fighting.
And I apologize, that's the wrong video. So the bottle throwing happened after that. You can YouTube it at home yourself if you want, but suffice to say, it was a disgrace. But Marvin, after this fight, went on to become the most accomplished middleweight champion of all time. He held the title for over 7 years. I think he had 12 title defenses, I believe. He had classic fights against Tommy Hearns, as I mentioned, which a lot of people say was the greatest 3 rounds in boxing history. He beat Roberto Duran, who was a great champion, and then we all know in Brockton that he actually beat Sugar Ray Leonard, but he lost the decision. So something that'll be debated forever. But that was actually the biggest box office draw of all time at the time. And Marvin had a chance to have a rematch with Sugar Ray Leonard, which would have been an even bigger box office for him, and was never able to have that fight. And then he ended up moving to Italy, and he became an action movie star in Italy. He learned Italian, spoke fluent Italian, he got remarried and built a life over there, and he ended up having a house. He had a house here in the White Mountains up in Bartlett, New Hampshire, and he had a house in Italy, and he split his time between there. And he remained close with, do you have it? To the bottles? I think we have the fight here. Yep. Yeah. They must have cut it out. It is on YouTube. I apologize for that. Anyway, I apologize for that, but I think they cut it out of somewhere because it's pretty bad. It's pretty graphic. The bottles are flying and smashing all over the ring and all that. But so to wrap up here, before I open it up to some questions, I wrote this book because, as I said, I don't feel like Marvin Hagler ever got his proper due. I feel like a lot of people looked at his legacy as, he lost the fight to Sugar Ray Leonard and then moved to Italy and disappeared. We never heard from the guy again. But to me, that's not his legacy. To me, his legacy is this story that I tell in this book. It's a guy who comes out of a very desperate, terrible family situation, moves to a new city, takes on these challenges, picks himself up by the bootstraps, and fights alongside his trainers the corruption in the industry in the 80s and becomes one of the greatest world champions of all time and endures that terrible fight. But to what I was saying before, he's not he's not Muhammad Ali, he's not Bill Russell. He never talked about this, and when he was asked about it, even after the fight, in the days after, he's like, oh, that was unfortunate, that shouldn't have happened, but, I'm on to my next fight. He's very Belichickian about it. And I loved that about Marvin, and he would never be the one to say, I beat that racist, I did this. He wasn't like that, but by telling this story and sharing it with younger generations, they can see how you handle yourself in these situations and how you don't stoop to that level and you overcome it, you beat it, you win, and you take care of business. And that, to me, is the legacy of Marvelous Marvin Hagler. So with that, I will open it up. I'll open it up to some questions. Anyone have any?
David, I think it should be pointed out that they became friends later. Mentor and Hagler, great friends again. But my question is, how did he die?
Marvin?
Yeah.
So there's a lot, yeah. So him and Minter, I wouldn't say they became friends, but they did kind of reconcile. And, Minter did apologize for making that terrible comment. And, Marvin Marvin didn't dwell on it and didn't, he won the fight. He became the champ. So he didn't have, he said everything he had to say through his actions, But they did a couple public appearances together. And Marvin actually, after that fight, said, I will never fight in England again. And he never did. But he did go back for a fight when him and Minter shook hands in the ring. So I thought that was a great healing moment, especially for England, because it really was a black eye on boxing in England. A lot of the black fighters wouldn't fight there after that. And you can't blame them. It was just a dangerous place for them to be after that. But Marvin's death, so, he was a pretty healthy guy. I think he was 66 years old. It was the end of COVID, and there's a lot of people speculated that it had something to do with the vaccine. We'll never know. I don't know if they can test for that. They're certainly not going to do a post-mortem on him now, but, he died of a heart attack in his sleep up in New Hampshire, a couple of weeks after having the shot. So whether or not it was related, I don't know. They just said natural causes is what they called it. But again, there's been a lot of online speculation that it had something to do with the COVID vaccine, but I don't think we'll ever know. Anyone have any questions?
How did you and Casey get together?
The question is, how did me and Casey get together? It's a great question. So Casey Sherman, who we've written several books together, and Casey's from Barnstable. I grew up in Brockton, and Casey was a producer at Channel 4 in Boston, and I was a reporter at the Boston Herald, and we kind of knew each other from work. But actually, the way I first met Casey was he wrote his first book about, it was called A Rose for Mary, about his aunt, who was the last victim of the Boston Strangler. And I was a reporter at the Herald, and my editor came over to me one day and he's like, hey, this producer from Channel 4 wrote some book about his aunt getting killed by the Boston Strangler. Can you, do a story on it? So I actually interviewed Casey and I did a story about Casey in the book. That was how I first met him. And then we kind of stayed friends over the years, and he had just finished writing The Finest Hours, which you guys all know The Finest Hours, that book that Casey did about Coast Guard rescue in Chatham. And when the bombings happened on Boylston Street, I was in the middle of it for the Herald. I was the lead reporter. And after, things settled down a few weeks later, I had been thinking about doing a book. I had some other cases that I had opportunities to write books for over the years, but never really attracted me to give up a year of my life, and take a leave from the paper. But this one obviously was a big story, and I knew there was going to be multiple books about it, and I was right in the middle of it. So Casey and I got together and decided to team up and do it. So that's how we started. Yeah. And now we've since written 6 books, and we actually might have another one in the works. We'll let you know. We got it. We do a lot of stuff together. We actually did, for the 10-year anniversary of the bombings, we showed Patriots Day at the Orpheum in Chatham, and we did a Q&A like this. And but yeah, Casey's great. If you haven't seen him speak, he's a very dynamic speaker and great storyteller. So, yeah. Yeah, Don King. It's funny. I have his cell phone, and I called him a bunch of times for this book, and finally some assistant answered, and she was like, "He's not going to talk to you." So he wouldn't talk to me. So, I'd love to interview Don King. I have a lot of questions from about this one, but he didn't want to hear it. There's a great book about Don King called Only in America. I don't know if you've seen that one, but I read that. It's a great book. But a lot of corruption in those days, and not so bad now. But one other piece I'll just mention real quick is if you do love that sort of organized crime stuff, there's some great stuff in the book about the era that Rocky Marciano boxed in. And I have a couple of chapters on Rocky's history. And in the 40s and 50s, it was really run by the mob. And Rocky, being an Italian-American, couldn't get away from it. And he rejected it all. He hated it. He did have some dealings with the mob after his career. He actually became a loan shark when he was, and he worked for some of the mobsters. But if you like that sort of stuff, there's some great little details in there about that. Chris, how are you, buddy?
How are you? Good to see you.
Good, you too?
Question. 1987, Marvin's last fight with Sugar Ray Leonard, right? Never fights again. You think that's because he was turned off by the decision and it just soured him so much he never wanted to get back in the ring?
I think so, and I think this story that I tell in this book is really why, because as I mentioned, I don't know when you walked in, but his first bad decision was Boogaloo Watts in Philadelphia. I think it was 1974. And that was his first introduction to how judges could decide his fate. And he, the rest of his career, he was like, I brought my judges. He had his two fists. But then he had the horrible decision against Vito Antuofermo. And then the third one was the Leonard fight. And I think after that, in addition to the fact that, all the stuff with Don King and the tournament scandal and all that, and all that him and the Petronelli brothers went through, I just think he knew that he would never get a fair shake in Vegas and by the sport, no matter how good he was. And I think he felt like, I beat everybody. I accomplished everything I wanted to accomplish. He became the greatest of all time, really, top 10 boxers of all time and top 1 or 2 middleweights, if not number 1. And I just think he knew he didn't have anything else to prove. Separately, he was having some personal problems with his wife, Bertha, at the time. They got divorced. He moved to Italy, and I just think it was a whole new lifestyle over there. He was away from the media. He was away from people asking him, "You gonna have a rematch? You gonna have a rematch?" And I think he just liked the quietude of sitting in a cafe sipping a cappuccino. I think he liked it, and he. I mean, it's amazing to think that this guy in his 30s learned fluent Italian and became a movie star in Italy. He was on soap operas and he did movies, and then he met his wife and he got remarried, and then that was it. I just think he was never going to look back. So, it's I wanted to see him fight Leonard again, though. The Petronelli brothers, good question. So, again, they were both World War II vets. They lived well into their 80s, both of them. They died. Goody and his wife died within like 6 months of each other. He was married for 55, 60 years, maybe more. And he lived right near Brockton. I think he was in East Bridgewater. One of them was in Sandwich, actually. I think it might have been Pat was living in Sandwich. But they both died. They both died before Marvin, but they were well into their 80s because they were older when they started training them. I mean, they were already in their 50s when they started training them. So they did. The question is, did the Petronelli brothers ever have any other famous fighters? They did. They trained a guy named Drake Thadze that became a heavyweight champ. I fought for the title a couple times, and then they had Irish Stevie Collins was a great middleweight after Marvin. Robbie Sims, who was Marvin's brother, who after Marvin retired, Robbie Sims had some really big fights. He fought Roberto Duran, I believe, and beat him. I think he beat Roberto Duran. I might be wrong. Any boxing people know from he beat Duran? What's that? He did. That's right. Yeah, he beat Roberto Duran, and then thank you. Yeah, and Duran's career, but Robbie was a tough kid too. And then they also had they had one other one, Kevin McBride. I think they worked with Kevin McBride. They have McBride? Kevin McBride? Yeah. And I think McBride was the last guy to beat Mike Tyson. I believe. I think that's right, until Jake Paul, if you count that. So. But yeah, so, I appreciate everybody coming, and, whether you like boxing or not, I think there's a beautiful story of, like, friendship, and I think, there's a lot of history in it. I really get into the history of Newark and Brockton, and a lot about the Cape, Provincetown. Provincetown was such a huge part of Marvin's success, and it's funny you bring up Casey. Casey and I always talk about it. Casey's mad that he didn't write this book, okay? Because Casey used to carry spit buckets for Marvin Hagler down at P-Town when he was a little kid. Casey and his brother used to box amateur, little kid boxing, and they would have him down to the P-Town, and Casey would carry Marvin's spit bucket. So, anything else? No? Well, thank you all so much. And if anyone wants a signed book, I'll be up there. I'll sign some books. Thank you.